Welcome to History Channel. Be sure to subscribe and like so you don't miss out on more videos like this one. In December 1918, Ante Pavelić announced the unification of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs with Serbia, a moment that gave rise to what would later be called Yugoslavia. The declaration reflected hopes for stability after World War I but also laid the groundwork for decades of complex national tensions across the Balkans. Porfirio Diaz, shown in a 1910 portrait, ruled Mexico for over 30 years through multiple presidencies. Despite his initial rise on promises of no re-election, he extended his grip on power until the Mexican Revolution erupted. Within a year, he was overthrown, marking a turning point in Mexico's modern history. Rusin villagers gather in a Galician marketplace during the 1920s, a time when Eastern Europe's rural life was defined by tradition and resilience. The market was not only for trade but also a meeting ground, reflecting the cultural richness and hardships of communities living under shifting borders and uncertain futures. In January 1979, a supporter of Ayatollah Khomeini stood over the crowd in Tehran, holding photographic evidence of atrocities by the army and Savak. This demonstration symbolized the growing anger against the Shah's regime, capturing the dramatic power of protest during Iran's revolutionary moment that would soon transform the nation. On July 1, 1962, the Belgian flag was lowered in Kigali as Rwanda celebrated its independence. The ceremony marked the end of colonial rule in the region. For Rwandans, it represented new beginnings but also the heavy challenge of building a future after decades of European dominance in African affairs. Jean Bedel Bokassa crowned himself Emperor of the Central African Empire in 1977 with his wife Catherine by his side. The lavish coronation consumed a third of the nation's budget, yet no world leader attended. The display symbolized extravagance and isolation, standing in stark contrast to the poverty of his people. A street in Alexandria during the 1950s appears unusually quiet, offering a rare glimpse into everyday urban life. The stillness contrasts with the city's long history as a hub of culture, trade, and Mediterranean activity. It is a frozen moment of calm before decades of dramatic regional and political change. In April 1943, a young boy worked as a pin setter in a Washington bowling alley. Known as a pin boy, his job required quick reflexes and long hours under noisy, smoky conditions. This photograph captures the gritty labor of children before the widespread automation of bowling alleys in America. After kamikaze planes struck the USS Bunker Hill near Okinawa on May 11, 1945, sailors walked through the devastation. Fires raged across the hangar deck, leaving twisted wreckage and heavy casualties. Over 600 men were killed, missing, or wounded, a stark reminder of the brutal cost of the Pacific War. In 1946, Germans cleared rubble from the area surrounding the Reichstag in Berlin. The once powerful symbol of German politics stood scarred by war, surrounded by ruins. Civilians, many of them women, carried out the exhausting work of reconstruction, reflecting both the destruction of the Third Reich and the slow path to recovery. In 1888, Belgian explorer Camille Khokhlov shook hands with local chief Madha Baik at Bangala Station along the Congo River. The photograph captures a moment of colonial diplomacy, though beneath the surface lay unequal power dynamics. It reflects the encounters that defined Europe's expansion in Africa during the height of imperial rule. Flying above the English countryside in mid-1944, Robert E. Halderman piloted the P-51B Iowa Butte, belonging to the 354th Fighter Squadron. The aircraft became part of both triumph and tragedy. Later, another pilot was lost with it in Germany. A reminder of the risks every mission carried during the war. In October 1944, Chaplain James S. Hannaford of Missouri led open-air Protestant services near Konzen, Germany. Using gas cans as an altar, he ministered to soldiers of the 24th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Amidst the war's destruction, the improvised service symbolized faith and resilience during one of the harshest campaigns in Europe. On January 13, 1991, Lithuanian civilians confronted Soviet tanks near the Vilnius TV tower. The tense standoff became a defining image of Lithuania's struggle for independence as the Soviet Union collapsed. Unarmed citizens facing armored vehicles highlighted both their vulnerability and determination to reclaim freedom after decades of Soviet domination. Polish insurgents gathered in May 1921 during the Third Silesian Uprising against German control. Armed and determined, they fought for the region's union with Poland after World War I. The photograph reflects both the nationalist fervor of the era and the turbulent borders, reshaped in the aftermath of the conflict. In June 1961, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip welcomed President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy to Buckingham Palace. The event symbolized a close Anglo-American relationship at the height of the Cold War, while also highlighting the glamour and global influence of the young American presidential couple. In 1947, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy and Queen Elena lived in exile in Alexandria, Egypt. Once rulers of Italy, they had been forced to leave after the monarchy's downfall at the end of World War II. Their quiet life in exile contrasted sharply with their former position of power. In April 1994, a child from Thokoza Township stood watching as a soldier of the South African Defense Force patrolled the street. Violence between ANC and IFP supporters scarred the area. The image captured both the innocence of youth and the heavy presence of political conflict in South Africa's transition. George Atzerodt, a German-American conspirator in Abraham Lincoln's assassination, had been tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson. On the night of the plot, he became drunk and failed to act. His inaction spared Johnson but did not save him from trial and execution alongside the other conspirators. In July 1944, German SS personnel at Majdanek extermination camp handled Zyklon B canisters, the chemical used in gas chambers to kill prisoners. This photograph, grim in its clarity, later became damning evidence. The men pictured were eventually tried and executed, representing one of the countless acts of justice after the Holocaust. In 1937 Shanghai, a young Chinese boy soldier sat writing in a book. Said to belong to a communist army during the Second Sino-Japanese War, his image reflects the reality of children swept into conflict. Captured by photographer Harrison Foreman, it remains a haunting record of war's toll on the innocent. In 1939, a Nazi rally was held in New York City, reflecting the presence of sympathizers in the United States before World War II, organized at Madison Square Garden. It drew thousands under banners blending American and Nazi symbols. The event remains a chilling reminder of extremism reaching American soil. Guerrillas of the Shan State Army were photographed crossing the Salween River in Burma around 1981, armed and determined. They carried their struggle against the central government through jungle terrain. The river crossing highlights the resilience of insurgent groups that have fought for autonomy in Myanmar's borderlands for decades. In 1914, a German cruiser shelled Whitby Abbey, damaging centuries-old ruins along England's coast. The attack, part of a naval raid, shocked civilians and symbolized the war's reach into historic and cultural landmarks. The scarred abbey stands as a reminder of how even ancient sites became casualties of modern conflict. Australian photographer Rennie Ellis captured a lively pub scene in Brisbane in 1982. His work often documented social life with candid honesty. This image reflects the atmosphere of camaraderie, laughter, and local culture, freezing in time a moment of everyday leisure during an era of change in Australian urban identity. In December 1941, Chinese-American waitress Ruth Lee posed with a Chinese flag to distinguish herself from Japanese Americans amid rising hostility after Pearl Harbor. Her gesture reflected the climate of fear and discrimination. The photograph shows how individuals sought to protect themselves from prejudice during a time of global war. In 1875, Chinese fishermen were photographed in Monterey, California. Many had come during the gold rush era and later turned to fishing for survival. Their presence shaped the early fishing industry along the Pacific coast, though they faced discrimination and restrictive laws that threatened their livelihoods in a rapidly changing America. In 1954, Soviet agent Nikolai Khokhlov defected to the West, handing over a cache of assassination devices to West German authorities. He had been ordered to oversee the killing of an anti-communist activist in Frankfurt. His defection exposed the deadly reach of Cold War espionage and Soviet covert operations abroad. In July 1863, at Gettysburg's slaughter pen, bodies lay scattered among the boulders as wounded soldiers stood amid the devastation. Men from Alabama and Georgia fell heavily in the brutal fighting. This haunting image captured the raw aftermath of one of the Civil War's bloodiest and most decisive battles. On January 31, 1990, McDonald's opened its first restaurant in Moscow, drawing massive crowds. Thousands of Soviet citizens stood for hours to experience a taste of the West. The moment symbolized cultural change at the twilight of the Cold War, when simple fast food became a sign of transformation. In August 1944, a Polish resistance fighter from the Home Army stood ready at the start of the Warsaw Uprising. Determined yet under-equipped, he represented the city's desperate struggle against Nazi occupation. The uprising would become a tragic chapter of courage, sacrifice, and devastating destruction in Poland's wartime history. Around 1917, the daughters of Tsar Nicholas II were photographed in the garden of Alexander Palace, their heads shaved after contracting measles. Anastasia, Tatiana, Olga, and Maria stood together during the turbulent final years of Imperial Russia. Within months, the family would be swept away by revolution and tragedy. In November 1953, Italian students attacked a Yugoslav car outside the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Their anger followed reports of Italians killed in Allied-occupied Trieste, where tensions ran high over territorial disputes. The violent scene reflected post-war Europe's instability and the lingering scars of national rivalries after World War II. In 2003, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein sat with American journalist Dan Rather for a televised CBS interview. Confident and defiant, Saddam demanded a debate with U.S. President George W. Bush, which never took place. The exchange occurred just weeks before the US-led invasion that toppled his authoritarian rule. In February 1909, Geronimo, one of the most famous Apache leaders, was photographed for the last time. A symbol of native resistance, He had fought against US and Mexican forces for decades before surrendering. This final portrait shows the aging warrior months before his death, closing a fierce chapter in history. During the Sudetenland crisis of September 1938, young British men lined up at a London recruitment office. Fears of war with Germany pushed enlistment, even as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain pursued appeasement. This scene captures the anxiety of a generation preparing for conflict on the eve of World War II. In 1942, students in Dunklin County, Missouri, posed for a photograph on the last day of school. Rural education in wartime America was marked by modest classrooms and strong community ties. The image reflects the resilience of small-town life during years of global uncertainty and rapid social transformation. Between 1839 and 1841, an early daguerreotype portrait of a lady was created. The photograph represents the infancy of photography, when long exposures required sitters to remain perfectly still. Its clarity and detail capture the fascination of a new invention that was beginning to change how people recorded their lives. In 1897, one of the rare photographs of Queen Victoria smiling was taken. Known publicly as a stern and serious monarch, she privately enjoyed humor and warmth with her family. This candid moment revealed a different side of the Queen, softening her image during the final years of her reign. In 1991, a statue of Karl Marx in Addis Ababa was splattered with mud and paint following the fall of the Derg regime. Once symbols of Marxist ideology, such monuments became targets of anger. The defaced statue reflected Ethiopia's rejection of authoritarian rule and the collapse of a brutal dictatorship. On May 17, 1937, John Cobb raced his powerful Napier Railton at Brooklands during the Gold Trophy coronation race, producing 580 horsepower. The car was a marvel of engineering. Cobb's racing career would make him a legendary figure in motorsport, remembered for daring speed and groundbreaking land speed records. On August 20, 1944, sailors painted a scoreboard on the USS Enterprise, marking Japanese ships and planes destroyed. The carrier played a central role in the Pacific War, earning the nickname the Big E. This image captures the pride and relentless effort of a crew that helped turn the tide. In 1886, Alfred Packer, known as the Colorado Cannibal, was photographed during his trial. Accused of killing and eating fellow travelers during a harsh winter expedition, his case shocked the nation. The grim photograph immortalizes one of America's most infamous frontier crimes and the disturbing stories of survival it revealed. In the severe winter of 1978-79, a VW bus became trapped in heavy snow in Kiel, northern Germany. Painted with the words, "Baden-Wein, spoiled by the sun," it stood stranded in icy drifts. The scene symbolizes the hardships of one of Europe's most brutal winters in living memory. In 1944, Japanese forces burned villages in Yan'an, China, leaving homes reduced to ash. Such scorched earth tactics were intended to cut supplies for communist armies. Thousands of communities across northern and central China suffered similar fates, reflecting the devastating toll of occupation during the long and brutal Second Sino-Japanese War. In May 1945, Czechoslovak soldiers marched a suspected collaborator through the streets of Telk to face judgment. With Nazi occupation ending, retribution against collaborators was swift. This image captures the tense atmosphere of liberation, when justice was sought, but emotions ran high in communities scarred by years of oppression and war. In March 1930, the funeral procession of Horst Wessel moved through Berlin. The young Nazi Party member had been killed in a brawl, but the movement turned him into a martyr, or Blutzeuge. His death was heavily propagandized, becoming part of the cult of sacrifice within early Nazi ideology. In the 1950s, Turkish President Celal Bayar, a veteran of the War of Independence, posed beside the nation's first helicopter, a Cayman K-225. This particular model was the only one exported outside the United States. The photograph reflected Turkey's modernization and growing connections with Western technology during the early Cold War. In April 1945, an American investigator questioned a young Hitler Youth member captured after blowing up a Jeep. Even in the final weeks of World War II, Nazi indoctrination drove children into desperate acts of sabotage. The scene highlights both the fanaticism of the regime and the tragedy of its collapse. In 1940, French civilians traveled by carrier cycle after cars were seized for the German war effort. The confiscation left families improvising transportation during the occupation. The simple cycle, burdened with passengers, reflected the daily hardships of occupied France and the resilience of ordinary people under the pressures of wartime.